ready. Let's talk Portuguese. Durante o lockdown, you may have been working a fazer home office, almoçando takeaway, and scrolling through the feed on the ecrã on your phone. You may have bought that phone after you saw it in the vitrina of a store or have gotten it from the equipa at your job. That sentence is chock full of what are known as loanwords or word borrowings or even neologisms. All of those are ways of saying words that came into a language from another language or an outside source. These are external borrowings of new terms into a language. A neologism on its own is in fact just a new term or word that enters a language, regardless of whether it was an external or internal coinage. So a neologism can be a new word that came from within the language itself, and languages have many mechanisms by which they adopt new words internally. The most common of these is to use etymological sources from the language from which the language itself is derived. What I mean with that is, for example, when we're talking about Romance languages, they will look to Latin and form new words on the basis of Latin words. Quite a lot of new vocabulary entered into the Romance languages in the medieval period and the period just after that as the result of Latin borrowing. But that's talking about internal sources for new words and terms. This video is going to be mostly focused on word borrowings or loan words, that is to say, the external sources of new terms and words. Those in Portuguese are called empréstimos. Another term that is used is estrangeirismo. And if we go back to those first examples that I gave, you'll notice that there's a mix of words that seem perfectly naturally Portuguese and words that seem a lot more obviously foreign in Portuguese. There is a process of adaptation of neologisms by which words undergo nativization, or the process by which foreign words can become natural words in any given language. We'll get into that in just a moment, but before we do, I wanted to talk about something a little bit less scientific and a little bit more sentimental. There is no shortage of articles and opinions and videos and what have you out there in the world complaining that there are too many English words in use in Portuguese. That Portuguese is being overrun by English and it is decharacterizing the language, and that we're on a slow march to just speaking a corrupted, Latinized form of English. Now that is obviously an extreme, but I'm here to say that this perception of the corruption of language is as old as language itself. Even in antiquity, in Latin itself, there were plenty of people who considered that the Latin that some other people spoke was irreparably corrupted, and that they should be speaking in a different, more pure manner. This is a perpetual debate in most, if not all, major languages at any given point in their history. It may not be the case in English right now, but that's simply because English is the global lingua franca. English was not always the main language used internationally. At one point before it, that was French, and for many centuries that language itself was in fact Latin. These types of complaints are some of the best ways that we learn about the historical changes in language over time. The complaints by Latin speakers of the corruptions of Latin as people were speaking it are some of the best ways that we learned about the ways in which Latin was changed over time, which would go on to result in the Romance languages. That is, of course, a very simplified perspective, but this type of view of the linguistic world is in fact useful to linguistics in its own right. The vast majority of word borrowings in Portuguese nowadays are from English. That wasn't always the case, and in the period before English became the dominant language influencing Portuguese, that role was occupied by French. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, lots of the French words that entered Portuguese and are perfectly natural nowadays, such as vitrina or equipa, were seen as terrible estrangeirismos. This video is not meant to be a value judgment on whether there are too many English words in Portuguese, or how people should be using the English words that come into Portuguese or not. That ultimately is up to each speaker to determine for themselves, and determine in the context of other people reacting to their usage of those words. But let's get back to the linguistic breakdown of what exactly these neologisms are. As I mentioned already, a neologism is simply a new term that comes into a language. A new turn of phrase or a new word can be taken as a neologism even long after it has been fully incorporated into a language. language. But essentially, any new term, whether that's internally or externally derived, is a neologism. There are many different types of loan words that we can have in a language. There are calques, or literal translations in one language of terms used in another language. An example of this would be something like cachorro quente for hot dog, or even manteiga de amendoim for peanut butter. There are loan words that become adaptations in any given language, whether that be because they are orthographically adapted or phonetically adapted. Examples of this are terms like blackout, linchar, boycott, and so on in Portuguese. And there are other terms that we consider incorporations because they are left unmodified. These terms can still be adapted into the language in some way. They can be reduced into parts that make sense to the logic of any given language. A good example of this in Portuguese is the term stress. In European Portuguese, we write stress in exactly the same way that we would in English from which it was taken. But we have terms like estressado and estressar in Portuguese because it is morphologically productive. That productivity comes in the form of being able to adapt it to the affixes or the other parts that we add onto the words in Portuguese. Other incorporations that are common in Portuguese are things that relate to technology like link, software, and even cultural uses like check-in or DJ. There can also be new meanings adapted to existing words in a language. A great example of this would be the usage of casual and eventual in their English senses in Portuguese. Many purists would advise against using these terms in such a manner in Portuguese. And by and large, in terms of external borrowings, those are the major categories. In Portuguese linguistics, neologismos and estrangeirismos are usually separated from empréstimos based on the level of adaptation and acceptance into Portuguese vernacular. It's important to note here that spelling doesn't necessarily change this, as we've seen with words like stress. This is also true of other terms like email, software, and check-in, which have a different pattern of pronunciation in Portuguese because they've been fully adapted into the language, but haven't undergone orthographical changes to adapt them to Portuguese. Usually, a term will come into Portuguese as a term that is not well known and is explained in quotes or given context or an equivalent Portuguese word in order to contextualize it in its usage. From there, the term will pass on into greater usage and will no longer require the explanation that was originally given to it. This is the most common initial part of word borrowing in Portuguese. But a word doesn't cease to be a neologismo until it has become fully incorporated into Portuguese. And this often entails that word taking on new meanings even after it was borrowed. These meanings can be parallel to the uses in the language from which they were derived, or they can be entirely new meanings on top of that. We have plenty of examples that we could choose from in the latter case. Words such as top in both Portugal and Brazil have come to mean something slightly different to what it means in English. And even in Brazil, words like blitz have taken on additional meaning that are specific to a Brazilian cultural context. When words become rooted into Portuguese in this sort of manner, they will usually enter into the dictionary. Once these words are dicionarizadas in this sort of a way, they cease to be neologisms and they are then just fully incorporated words into the Portuguese language. That doesn't necessarily mean that every single speaker of the language agrees with their usage in the language in the first place, or even that they agree that they are no longer neologisms to be avoided, but it does mean that those words come to take on a general, widespread acceptance in the vernacular. So the next time you find yourself using shiny new English words to describe things that are going on in the current times, as we have had recently with things like lockdown and home office, and also when you see the umpteenth article about how there are too many anglicismos in Portuguese, you can use this information to put that into context and determine better for yourself whether you think that those words are necessary or unnecessary for the language that we're speaking. Whether we like the terms used themselves or not, word borrowing is an essential part of language, and it is a core concept in linguistics. So I dare say that's quite a lot of information for one video. If you would like to learn more about this, I will be including the sources that I've used to research this video, as well as more information about neologisms and word borrowings on my Patreon. On my Patreon, I include sources that I use for my videos and even further information about the things that I've talked about in my videos. I also let you know on my Patreon what kind of videos I'm working on next first, and I also have fun things on offer like postcards. So if that's something that you'd be interested in, head on over to patreon.com/Sashinka, where you can find out all of the information. Also, if you'd like to talk to other people who are interested in Portuguese, linguistics, and other cultural topics, you can join the Discord server that I've set up for this channel. channel. The invite link to the Discord is in the description of all of my videos and is also available on my channel. So if you'd like to chat with me about anything related to Portuguese, Portuguese linguistics, and other related cultural topics, I look forward to chatting with you on the Discord. So that's all I've got for this video. If you enjoyed it, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, leave me a thumbs up down below. You might think about subscribing to my channel if you're not already. I make lots of videos about the Portuguese language, which you can find in playlists directly on my channel or in the eye above, and I will see you next time.